Thank you very much and welcome everybody. My name is Fritz Reusswig. I'm a sociologist and philosopher and I'm working at Climate Institute. And today I was asked to give sort of a lecture on a very broad topic, and I asked myself why? Why justify why you are there? Because why do we need all this sustainability stuff? Because if you walk outside, there's so many things going on that you ask yourself, why do we need this in addition? We do have trams and we do have all kinds of fancy things, and we have to take care that the bus doesn't take us. So why caring for sustainable development? And one thing I think is what is your topic is global environmental change and change management, and I would like to stress this environmental thing because both change and global are very common things, right? The change is going on all the time. Change is the basic principle of life, and it is the basic principle of human history. So there is nothing new to change. Change is the common thing. And in order to manage change, you need all kinds of skills, whether it be business, whether it be political, whether it be psychological, all kinds of change. I do not talk about this one. So change is a very ubiquitous thing, first. And then global, again, it's not, I mean, globalization is an issue for about 20 years now, but in fact, this planet has been globalized in different waves in history, and the mere existence of humankind is a sort of the first globalization anyway. We started out in Africa and then we moved across the planet. And Immanuel Kant, for example, German philosopher of the Enlightenment, really very often comes back to this fact that we are inhabiting a globe and not a plane. Would we be on a plane, it would be possible to move and move and move on without meeting people. But one day we meet each other. We have inhabited this finite space, and we meet people again, time and again. And in a way, this whole globalization thing, whether it be internet or whatever, is now a form of realization of something that started very, very early on, since we started to move out of Africa. So again, this is nothing special, right? It's a topic that can be discussed in various ways. Now, sustainability comes in, I think, mainly because of this global environmental change thing. So the environment is somehow a critical element that has entered human history. Now, without the environment, which is a funny word in any term as well, because Umwelt, for example, the German word, was introduced in the 1920s. It's an artificial word. And it was introduced by a biologist to describe the specific environment of animals. So it's a very subject-centered thing, which has to do with something that an organism can perceive or can act upon, right? There's a lot of environment that is not relevant for an organism. The very close environment that it can perceive or it can act upon is its specific Umwelt. And environment has been, if you could term it nature or something, has been the basis of life for all kinds of human beings. But the specific point I think we have to learn new, or why it is important today, is that modern society tends to forget about this environment. I think this is somehow in a critical phase in the terms of environmental crisis. Then we remind ourselves that it is somehow important. And this is, again, if you look at the long course of history, then it is very funny that modern society has tended to forget about nature. It is a luxury, right? If you are living on, on shifting agriculture or on hunting or on whatever natural resource management you have, in various human societies, you always had to care for nature, and you always knew that the management of this resource and its sustainability, if you like, the reproduction rate, for example, is crucial. And the rules to protect it from overuse, the tragedy of the commons and everything like that. So for traditional societies with very limited organizational and energetic means, it was a very natural thing to think about the environment as a crucial resource that must not be overused. Nevertheless, modern societies, which started somehow in Europe and North America in the somewhen, there's a debate among historians when it started, it was the 16th century or the 18th century or the 19th, it doesn't matter. This modern society tended to neglect this, and it was able to do so very effectively, if you like. And what is a modern society? I mean, it's a society that has different characteristics, like markets play an important role. We have an industrialization process. We have urbanization as a form of living, which is very new, if you like. We have a functional differentiation between people instead of other forms of differentiation. And we have a disembedding of preferences from traditional rules like you should not or customs. It's more or less connected to the market. You can want what you like, which is also something very new. Even European societies in the medieval ages, there was no such thing like a free preference or something. It was you were born into a specific community and a stratum of society, and this would define what you could do or what could not do and what you would want or dream of. Right? It was not like, you want a new car, can have it, just have to earn money. This is something very new. And in many societies, communities would define, or would in a way define the borderlines of your preferences. Now we have, in modern societies, disentangled this, and it's a process of liberalization at the one hand and freeing, and on the other hand, it was a risky thing at the same side. And very importantly, of course, all this was possible, made possible due to the availability of cheap energy, of fossil-based energy system, coal, oil, and so forth, which gave communities, societies, and individuals unknown forces and unknown possibilities, right? The energy that the power that you dispose of sitting in an Audi, for example, at your foot tips, and mobilize it just like that, just to bypass a bus, if you translate that in energy terms, many farmers in traditional societies would have liked to have this. I mean, it's a lot of power that you mobilize just like that. Yeah? It's how many horsepowers, how many horses do you have, and who could afford to have a horse? Yeah? Mainly humans had to rely on muscle force, on their own muscles. Animals, I mean, you have to feed them, you have to protect them from any kind of disease and something like that. So animals are an investment, right? So usually you had yourself, your family, your friends, and so forth, your kinship that help you, the muscle force, right? But this is of course very, very difficult and time-consuming and so forth. And so people like to have that source of energy, fossil fuels, which was the cheap energy and allowed us to transform the whole planet, basically, to fly. Come on, yeah? How much gasoline or what they have, this specific type of gas they use to fly, we used to fly. I mean, this is very concentrated. I mean, it's incredible how much power is in that, and we tend to forget that. And we have a whole kind of artificial materials which nobody had before. And to some degree, we thought that nature would be not important anymore, right? We are not relying on solar irradiation and our muscle power, which is based on solar economy, right? The solar economy was a very limited economy, but it was a sustainable one as well. And with the introduction of those fossil fuels, we made ourselves independent of all those limitations, of the annual inflow of solar energy, which is a very good thing, because we could mobilize a lot of stuff, and we could create modern agriculture. It's also depending on this input in energy. So we freed ourselves, and the limits of geography, it's a name of discipline. So the limits of the concrete space and its resources vanished, right? We became independent of that. And would this be possible to simply exteriorize all those effects and to get free from all this without any consequence? It would be fine, right? Because who would oppose something like, yeah, you have to pull it all yourself, or you can make like this, push a button, and then it's done by a machine. Who would oppose that? If it would be cost-free, or if there would be no costs attached to that, fine. But unfortunately, this is not truly the case, and this is what the environmental crisis reminds us. At least modern society, which is spreading across the globe. And so things like pollution, which was an early thing, which also occurred very early on as a side effect to all these nice things, was pollution. And by the way, environmental policy was something that was invented in cities very, very early on, because everywhere where people lived very closely together, highly concentrated, the consumption process and its remnants, and the production process, like making something which created noise and all kinds of pollution, water pollution, air pollution, was a concern very early on in human settlements. So the first, although we have a national policies on the environment only since the 1960s, 70s, in some countries much later, local communities did care for this, and there were laws on this very early on, as 2000 before Christ or something. In Babylonia we had this problem, of course, and in Rome and everywhere where humans lived together. Nevertheless, on a larger scale, not only on a city scale, this is a rather new development, and the more we lived on this planet and the more we consumed and the more we exteriorized things, the more it came back to us as pollution that had needed some kind of regulation. That's one thing. The other thing is, of course, things like the loss of space, the loss of biodiversity, which is a major concern. And in fact, it's, people talk about climate change, which is very serious, but it's, in the future it will become more serious. But even today, biodiversity loss is a very serious problem already, without climate change even. And all kinds of resource depletion, or, which was a big issue in the 1972 report of Meadows and so forth, Club of Rome, but also the peak of something, right? You know, this debate about peak oil, which is not about oil depletion in total, but about the price of oil once the peak of exhaustion, of production has been reached, right? There's a big debate on that, whether there's a peak oil or not, and whether there will be a peak everything or not. If this should materialize, and if engineers that tell us this is happening are correct, then the prospects for the global economy and the environment are very critical, because we can then predict that prices will go up, which to some degree creates problems, but on the other hand also creates energy conservation as an issue. Now, the latest thing that concerns people with respect to global environmental changes, as I said, climate change. And coming from a climate institute, I'm not a climate scientist, but from a climate institute, of course, this is my main issue, but I wanted to highlight that there are all kinds of other environmental problems, and locally, and we must not forget those, and we must not forget how they are also linked. I especially think about, if we think about countries in transition or emerging economies, it is very important that those other environmental issues are also kept in mind, because climate change is a very abstract concept to some degree, and it can be very useful to link things like air pollution to climate change. I will come back on this issue a little later. So, climate is as I said, a very abstract thing, right? Because the term climate is abstract. We seem to think that this is something tangible, but it's not in a way, right? Weather and climate are not the same thing. Usually climatologists would talk about average weather conditions of some parameters over 30 years or something at least. This is more statistical construct like climate. And then climate is also linked to all other kinds of processes in the Earth system, if you like. Now, climate change is a reality, yes, of course. The big problem that institutes like mine or IPCC, have you heard of IPCC, I think? Yes. They have been working, IPCC scientists have been working on in the last 10 to 15 years was to resolve the question whether, first, is there climate change? It's not easy to detect. And second, is it anthropogenic or not? And these are very crucial questions because, yes, there is climate change, but paleoclimatologists can tell you the further you look back in Earth's history, the more you will see that there's climate change. A change in climate is a natural phenomenon. As modern people, we tend to think that, the nature is stable and society is changing, right? Every year you get the summer collection for fashion and the winter collection, and there are new cars, and if you look at old movies, you see, well, the times are changing. It's such a rapid change. But trees on the photographs, they are always the same. So we tend to think that nature does not change, but we are changing. And in 50 years' time, some of us might be dead. So there's a lot of change there. And we tend to think that, well, the trees are still out there and the blue skies and everything. So nature is stable. But the longer time perspective you choose, you see that it's not the case. This planet is a very rapidly moving thing, and sometimes even rapidly moving without human intervention. Yeah? So we have to distinguish this anthropogenic climate change from the natural climate change we have. And this is very important, because politically very important, because would you just like detect that there was a change in climate and then say it's humans and then say you have to change, like do away with coal, do away with the car industry and everything because there's climate change, and 2 years later scientists would detect, look, we made a mistake, this is all natural, there's a natural cycle which we didn't know, but by the time we have destroyed the car industry and everything, right, it would be morally irresponsible from the scientists to say you have to change, whereas it was a natural thing, right? So it was very responsible activity. It was understandable that science has invested a lot in finding out whether it's a natural cycle and what is the anthropogenic part in it, right? And sometimes climate skeptics argue with those long-term curves, right? They say, look, temperature going up and down, and there was no car, right? So why should, if we are now in an up phase, why should we act, right? It's a very understandable thing, but being no climatologist myself, as I said, I have to trust the arguments of my colleagues, and what they say is, look, yes, you go back, you see the temperature. We have all kinds of natural records of temperature, right? Or proxies or something. It's a science in itself. Now, somehow we get the information about the temperature, and we get at the same time, we get the information about the concentration of greenhouse gases. They are majorly CO2, which is a natural thing. It's no pollution. CO2. And CO2 as a very limited thing in the atmosphere is somehow very crucial, because you can see that once CO2 is increasing for whatever reason, temperature is following, right? And this is due to natural causes. There's no car, no humans involved, right? That's true. But the important thing is that we should, that we know then, and we all agree, climate skepticists, and we agree, that the Earth climate is very sensitive to this change of CO2, right? We know this very well. But also we know that recently and currently and in the near future, as we might assume, unfortunately, the emission of CO2 from human sources, I mean the release of fossil fuels due to machines and electricity generation and car driving and so forth, we know exactly how much we add, right? Because most of this is fuel that you have to buy. You know what you have to pay because there are taxes on this. It's an economic good and it's taxed. And so we know very well about all this commercial fossil fuel that is sold on the planet. And once it is burned, you don't have to know how good your car is. Once it is burned, how much you transform into energy, into useful energy or not, doesn't matter. You can stand there and Once it is burned, you add such and such an amount of CO2 to the atmosphere. You know exactly. What you don't know, for example, is biomass, non-commercial biomass, which is important in many places on this planet, sub-Saharan Africa, but also in places like India and so forth. There we are somehow depending on assessments and something. But commercial fuels, we know exactly. And this is, I think, something like 9 or 8 gigatons per year. And as this is not all processed by the planet, like plant regrowth or something, it remains in the atmosphere stored, and it adds to the stock of natural CO2, and this is somehow increasing the Earth temperature. So we have a natural effect. We also know about the sun. There's a sun effect, yes, but the sun is cooling recently, unfortunately, or fortunately. And so this is like 80% of measured CO2. Temperature increase is attributable to human influence. And what is this climate change? Up to now, it's 0.8 degrees Celsius, centigrade Celsius, in the last 100 years. This is the measured global warming up to today, 0.8 degrees Celsius, which is not much at the first sight. Because, I mean, if you move outside this room, you will have temperature differences which are much larger than 0.8 degrees. Most people would not recognize 0.8 degrees. It's very little. So why should we bother about this funny 0.8 degrees? Now, to some degree, this depends on the entity we're talking about, global mean temperature, GMT. As I said, it's a statistical construct. There is no such thing as a global mean temperature. There's only temperature in Berlin at that time of the day, right? And inside and in Lichtenberg, and it will be in the Sahara differently, right? There are only concrete temperatures. So it's an average about all places of this planet, about all seasons of the year, and about all day and nighttime temperatures. So you see it's a very funny thing. It's about 15 degrees something, right? And as you know, without trace gases, we would be 30 degrees less, so there would be no life. That's a very good thing. But this 0.8 adds to the 15 or something that we would have naturally. And you might still say, well, this is not very, very, very significant. 0.8, 15 or 15.8, I mean, what's the difference? Now, the difference is remarkable. And one example, I think, should help you to understand. It's about the statistics. If in this room, for example, we would make an average of age, right? We would ask, how old are you? And then we make an average age. And then my little daughter, she is 6 years old. She would walk in and ask me to come home. Fortunately, she's at school. She wouldn't do that. But if she would, right? And we then would again recalculate the average age of this room, we would find a slight drop. If we would make the same experiment in the Berlin Olympiastadium, where 80,000 people are in, and my little daughter would walk in again, it would not be worth losing any second for this recalculation. It wouldn't make any difference. It would be, I don't know how many digits behind the comma. It's irrelevant because of the sheer number of people. Now, the global climate is more like the Berlin Olympiastadium than this room, because it averages out every kind of stuff, right? So when it's hot in one place, it's cold in another. So 15 degrees, I mean, this is a lot of things going in there. If you manage to shift 15 to 15.8, a lot of things must have happened in many places. And in fact, global warming occurs in places differently. For example, at the equatorial region, there is almost no increase of temperature, whereas at the poles, you have something like 2 degrees or something. In Germany, we have something like 1 degree. This is all in this 0.8, right? In the equatorial regions, there is no change almost, which means that in other places, there has been a lot of change. This is why the poles are very vulnerable and very sensitive regions, and with all the ice caps and so forth. So a lot of things have happened. Now, the next question would be, okay, this is going on. Where should we stop all this? Where does dangerous climate change start? Because 0.1 degree, 0.2 degree, like you have a frog and you warm it. When will it die? I mean, what is the critical number? And this is a very non-trivial question. There is a global, if you like, regulation, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. Adopted in 1992, I think, in Rio, besides the Convention on Biodiversity, CBD, and desertification, I think, as well. So it's a United Nations international policy thing, right? And it was signed by almost every nation, also by the US, by the way. The US did not sign the Kyoto Protocol, but they signed the UNFCCC. And in Article 2 of this convention, it states, not literally, but somehow in the sense, it says like, humankind should stop global warming at a dangerous interference with the climate system. So we should stop dangerous climate change. Now, what is dangerous climate change? Scientists have talked years to find out what that means. This document is, as most diplomatic documents, very mute about specifying what that means in terms of degrees, because the diplomats, they didn't know what it meant. It's dangerous. And it's a wise decision, right? Would science find out that dangerous means 0.1 degree? This would be a very limited definition. Would they find out 3 degrees are tolerable? Then dangerous would mean 3 degrees. Now, there is something like a conventional between scientists and politicians, and it is now in the documents also that this famous 2 degrees goal should be somehow adopted. And the European Union has adopted it, and in 1995 and so forth. So it's a very old goal, which means that plus 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels would be the operationalization of dangerous climate change. So we have to act on this. Remember that 0.8 have already been reached. And due to the inertia of the system, it's not like I emit something today and tomorrow temperature goes up like that. No, it's a very, very slow system, and it takes a couple of years until this happens. So the scientists talk of a commitment. Yeah? The Earth system is committed to additional 0.6 degrees, at least, global warming, due to the emissions that have been made until this very day. So would we stabilize our emissions today, we would experience additional 0.6 degrees at least, which leaves us with 1.4 degrees, which are already realized or unavoidable. So 1.4 degrees means, well, it's a change, right? And in different regions of the world, it really means something. And this means that adaptation to climate change is a must option. In the last 20 years, there had been a large dispute about mitigation versus adaptation, whether I stress versus. And especially developed country NGOs, environmental NGOs, have somehow been reluctant to adaptation, let me put it mildly, because at the beginning they thought this would be like giving in, giving up, right? If we adapt, we accept it, but we have to fight it in the first place. So adaptation was somewhat an ideological thing, and if you follow the newspapers, in Germany, for example, in Der Spiegel or so, there have been heated debates about would we invest our €1 in mitigation or in adaptation, because it's different. The logic behind it is different, and if you have only €1 to spend, and I mentioned the word euro, especially these days, we have to be careful about the euro, so you can't spend it twice. So it is a wise decision. You have to really think about it, what to do with this €1 if you can spend it only once. And there's a clear difference between mitigation and adaptation, right? Should a country like Germany decide to be even more efficient in some degrees or leave something aside, and all of the rest of the world would not follow, global temperature would still increase. It wouldn't matter. The famous Chinese, right? They open up electricity generation facilities every week in the amount of what we save every year or something like that, right? So it would not be wise to do this. It's an irrational choice. Would you instead take this €1 or 1 million or what have you in order to protect yourself, for example, more dikes or higher dikes or disaster preparedness facilities, you would be protected whatever the Chinese do, right? This money would be well spent, especially if the Chinese do not follow your mitigation option. So it's a different logic behind that, and it seems to be much wiser to protect yourself against climate change, to adapt, instead of mitigate. I mean, I'm talking about a country like Germany. I'm not talking about countries like Zimbabwe or whatever, where adaptation and mitigation have different positions and where the need to adapt due to some changes that go on are really very, very clear and obvious to some degree. I'm talking about a country like Germany where, I mean, the really severe climate change impacts are not as felt as vividly as in other places, right? So we have this kind of ideological discussion, if you like. But I would argue this is not really a choice we have. As I said, climate change is going on, so it is wise to do the one thing. And in fact, both are mutually interdependent, if you like. Because those people that argue in favor of adaptation in the German case and say it is much more rational and the money is much better spent, it's cheap in fact, right? They tend to forget that it is not, it is crucial to what we do adapt. So what level of warming do we adapt to? 1 degree or 5 degrees, right? Yes, if it's only 1 degree global warming, which we have almost reached, then there are minor changes, and it is rather easy to adapt to that. But if we talk about a 5 degree warmer world, it's a completely different world because humankind has not experienced this in the last 10,000 years. And in the long run, the biggest problem is sea level rise because most of the people live around the shorelines of this place. And we are not talking about Bangladesh only. We are talking about high capital investment in Florida, in New York, in Singapore, in Shanghai. These are the places where the world economy depends upon, right? And you have to evacuate them with 5 degrees in the long run. Not tomorrow, but in the long run, right? And you can't tell me that it's an easy job with redistributive problems of all kinds, to evacuate New York City and to compensate those people, to compensate for, I don't know, the capital investment of buildings, for example, or stuff like that. If you have to compensate those people, it's really, really expensive. The first place, they don't want to go. We know this from local floods. People get flooded, and they get offered, in Germany, they get offered a house in another place because they get told, look, this might happen the next 10 years once again. And you cannot make insurance here. So you would better move and we have a house for you. Many people don't move. They say, this is our house. My daddy built it. I don't move. And we prepare a little bit, so we stay here. So there will be all kinds of conflicts once adaptation has really the serious problem of this 5 degrees thing. So if people that propagate adaptation want to are right and want to keep being right, they should better help the mitigation people to limit global warming to something like 2 degrees. Otherwise, it's much too expensive. On the other hand, it's also mutually dependent because also mitigation people depend on that adaptation does a good job. Why? Most people mitigate or do something for the climate, if they do something, because they have fear. They are fearing the consequences of climate change. This might hit them. Some of them also might be very human-oriented and say, I don't want the people in Bangladesh to suffer, but most people are really suffer, they see their own suffering. They want to avoid this, right? They have fear. And due to the inertia of the system and due to this asymmetry between I do something and the whole system does not do something, it might well happen that you convince people to mitigate and to do a lot, but somehow temperature is still going up, right? And then you cannot prevent that natural disasters occur once in a while. And then people will come back and want their money back. They say, look, we did this. We have this energy-saving bulbs and everything, but still we have those storms. And you promised us that if we do this, climate change will not happen. We did it, and climate change is happening. So please, would you please give us our money back? In order to, if you want to prevent this, you have to make the system more resilient so that occurring, ongoing climate change does not translate into human damage or economic damage. So adaptation is needed to legitimize, in a way, mitigation efforts as well. So both are mutually independent. Okay, now I want to end by a story about two things. I mentioned the word resilience. I want just to tell you two stories because I have to somehow legitimize my CO2 emissions from flights, which I compensate, but to some degree I should also make use of them. And I tell you two stories. One was, I was recently to Egypt, and there were some people from the urban planning and architectural sector that talked about resilience. And they tended to, and I have mentioned the term myself, and it's a newer term than sustainable development, right? More recent term in science. And as a scientist, I somehow look at that a little bit more, and it's a more fashionable term somehow. There's a resilience alliance, there's all kind of research and so forth. And as people got used to the term sustainable development for 25 years now, they need something new. And resilience sounds good. It's a new word. And you can have everything in that of sustainable development somehow, but it's a new word. And somehow people that give away money to fund science somehow want to hear it. So you quote it a lot in order to get funds. And this is a very pragmatic thing. And then as a scientist, as a good person, you argument a little bit around and you argue. And then you say, okay, it's also a good word because resilience is a new concept and it means, I mean, don't you know what resilience means, by the way? You have heard of it, right? In German it's Resilienz, it's a Latin word, but I think in English it's more common. Nevertheless, it means something like to recover from stress, a system that is stable even under stress conditions, right? And in this debate with its urban planners, they had a lot of resilience. They wanted to make the whole system resilient. They talked about resilience and so forth. And my impression was that somehow they put everything they had from sustainable development into resilience as a new word and pumped it up. And I would argue that resilience is somehow a very narrow thing in a way. It's narrower than sustainable development to some degree. It's like if you talk, especially as an urban planner of non-resilient systems and to get more resilience, you are in a very uncomfortable position because you have to argue with people a lot around. There was some person that showed me buildings in Egypt at the Nile Delta or at the Mediterranean coast. They were constructed without any permittance, and it was a huge investment. It's not informal settlements, it's big hotels and so on. And the shoreline was that distant away from the building, right? It was just like that, or 10, 20 meters or something. So and we have tornadoes in the Mediterranean right now, which we hadn't. So a new phenomenon there, climate change is going on, and some people talk about tsunamis in the Mediterranean. I don't know, all kinds of things. So they will be really endangered. So they should not be there. And you have this also with a bigger problem, more complex problem is informal settlements and water bodies and so forth. And many people get marginalized, they get forced to very risky places like hill slopes or uphill or down to drainage where the water bodies are. So most of them are more vulnerable, right? That's a power thing, of course. But if you want to make these systems resilient, so to talk to very rich people, to talk to very poor people, we get in a lot of dilemma. And I mean, if once a person at the phone calls you or comes to your door and says, I'm from an insurance company, I want to talk to you about your insurance. Maybe you're underinsured, I can help you. Your reaction is not, oh yeah, come in, I have a lot of time for you, come here, I'm interested to hear, I'm underinsured. Oh wow, how could I forget about this? You say, look, I don't have time for this, come in tomorrow, I know, yeah, we have a party now, and people that tell us that we are living a risky life, we won't even listen to them, right? So if you want to sell resilience to people, you have a lot of conflict, because you must not build here, you have to provide the poor with better places, ha ha ha. Funny thing, right? Every planner in the city will like you if you tell them that. Or you say this is this global investment fund that builds those hotels. They have to be removed. It's also a funny thing, right? Yeah, it's difficult. But somehow resilience is a necessary thing. It's because we neglect perils and risks. We tend to neglect this, and this is why resilience is a necessary concept for urban planners and for all kinds of people. Yes. But it is not as broad as sustainable development. Sustainable development talks about it's like a system under shock, but sustainable development talks about the system in the longer future, if it can maintain in the future, right? So it's a broader concept to some degree. But still, also sustainable development, people try to inject a lot of things into sustainable development. All good things are in there, right? But I think if we look at the realities of the world, I think there's another sphere around the sustainable development, which I would like to call good life. Because people don't care about sustainable development to some degree, they care about their good life. And they have different definitions of what that is, yes, and there are conflicts about what is a good life, yes. But it's something they really want. If they care for themselves, or they care for their families, or they care for kids, if they want to make money, or they want to become spiritually clean, or whatever, it's all a conception of good life which is individual and culturally different. Right? But this is what they strive for. This is where their energy comes from. This is why they really save money, because they want to give their kids a good school education, or they want to build a house next year, or something. Or they have a career investment to make. This is what they care for. This is the good life. And it's no accident that ethics started in ancient Greece about the question, what is a good life? How can it be justified, and so forth. And this is somehow around the sustainable development thing. Sustainable development is something like a reality check, whether your concept of a good life can be sustained or not if you generalize it. And this is a necessary thing. So what I would say is, let's differentiate between those three things and see what they could contribute to each other. And at the final sphere, I see something like a moral discourse. I'm somehow influenced by Habermas, but not exclusively by him. But in fact, we are a global community, we are humans, and as I said, there are different cultural and individual definitions of what a good life is, yes. And as we are not isolated, it's not like everybody has its own hotel room with its own balcony, right? And then we could have different experimentations about the good life. Fine. If this would be the case, I think the way you live your good life does not majorly affect the way the others do. But in fact, it's not the case. We are living in communities, we are living together in cities in a global planet where everything is somehow connected. So what you do is somehow affected by the others, or what you do, it needs some input from other people. So we are in an interactive system. And this not only needs a check of sustainable development for good life, but also a check of a generalization. Can it coexist together? Is there some moral discourse about this? And as a Habermas influenced person, I tend to think, yes, there is a chance that we can have a discourse on what could be justified, what is justified or not, and what is a just term of it. It's a difficult thing as well, but I think if we do not strive for that, we are somehow lost. So my plea would be conceptually to distinguish between resilience, sustainable development, good life, and moral discourse, and we have to somehow link these spheres and not pump everything into one sphere to make it somehow, in a way, too fuzzy, if you like. The last thing I would like to talk about is the sort of lifestyle thing. I mentioned good life, and the other travel I was coming back from is from India, and we have a project there in a city called Hyderabad, in Andhra Pradesh, and it's about sustainable Hyderabad. That's the name of the project, and it's of course a very challenging thing to make a city like Hyderabad sustainable, which if you take all the dimensions of sustainability, it's 40% poor people living in informal settlements. On the other hand, you have a lot of rich people, not as many as poor, but you have some rich and influential people, and you have a growing middle class. And what you see is, you see it everywhere. That's why I think lifestyle and good life is very important to understand the dynamics of those systems, yeah? But what people want and what that leads to, and how we can justify that or not. One of the effects that it has is, of course, where it's visible, most visible thing is, besides urban sprawl, is, of course, traffic. Right? This is what many cities experience, is an explosion of traffic. And the way it is dealt with, right? I mean, we have all those two-wheelers, and we have as a starting point, and then we have small cars, and we have bigger cars, we have all kinds of cars. And the city tries to somehow deal with that with a very slow development of public transportation, which is it's a pity to see. There are all kinds of good solutions in other places, especially in Latin America. We have a lot of good examples there. But in India, and in some Indian cities also, but in Hyderabad is getting slow off. The way the city or the planning authorities deals with is building new streets and new flyovers everywhere, right? So if there's in this chaos where nothing is moving, they have money to build a flyover, and there's no entrance point, there's no entry point, if possible, between the inner city where the hotels are and the airport. And as a traveler on those highways, you like that, because after 10 or 15 kilometers, you find one entry point where the local traffic can enter, and then all kinds of vehicles enter, and all kinds of traffic behavior starts, like people crossing the streets like hell. Now, this is one example. The other example is consumption of materials and goods. And I mentioned this middle class thing because it's very important, and it's part of the inner differentiation of those big countries. I could also quote Brazil or other countries and China, but India is my example that I know a little better. And only 20 years ago, it was like an upper stratum of people, of rich people and influential people, and a large majority, very many rural people that were quite poor, under both international and Indian definitions of poverty, which differ, of course. But what we see in the last 20 years as a part of the liberalization process is that not only we have those growth rates, about 8% or something like per year. In China, it's 10. And it's a politicum. I mean, the party, one of the legitimations of the party, it takes away your freedom, the Communist Party in China. It controls society very strictly. Even the internet, everything, you know this, right? But the deal is, as long as this party somehow manages the country and helps growth to keep up, there is a deal, somehow a silent, more or less silent deal, that large parts of society would accept the leadership of the party. So for the party, it's absolutely crucial to have growth rates of like 10% per year. And I mean, 10% per year, it's huge, right? You know those famous examples of lakes that are getting encroached by plants with the growth rates of 1% per year, yeah? But 10% per year. In India, it's 8. The magic number is 8. And everybody, Indian politician would tell you that we need 8% in order to combat poverty and to get along, right? It's necessary, it's utmost necessary. But you cannot have those growth rates every year without changing the society. It's not the same society growing, it's a change of society due to this growth. And one of the, as a sociologist, one thing I'm really interested in is, of course, the change of the social composition and the aspiration of people and their habits and so forth. And of course, it's changing a lot. There is a famous study, not famous, but a good study. All kinds of people try to calculate how many middle-class people there are, right? And there are statisticians, social scientists, and there are, of course, banking people and marketing people that do the same thing because they are very interested to know, because these are huge numbers. I mean, you need a lot of Luxembourgs yes, of course. If the planet would be a Luxembourg, you could sell to those people a lot of stuff. Of very fashionable stuff, but unfortunately, or fortunately, there are not too many of those, right? But if the Indian 1.2 billion people, if there's only a marginal increase of the middle class, it's a huge sales advantage. And a lot of companies adapt to that. Yeah? You see a lot of, they have to learn this then as a marketing person in those countries, like to have very small portions of things, like shampoo, hair shampoo, for example. You could argue that if you take a German hair shampoo or French or whatever, Garnier or something, right, it would be impossible to sell it in India to the poor. But it's not true. You can sell it to the poor if you simply change your packaging, right? If you have a micro package of, I don't know, 50 rupees or something, yeah, so that you can wash your hair once or twice with that. You would not think about this in Europe. You would not sell a 10-cent size hair shampoo. It doesn't make sense in a way. But in India, it makes a lot of sense because this is the point where even the poor can afford and would like to have. And these are some kinds of ideas, the base of the pyramid to sell to them, right, marketing. And so a lot of people research how much does the middle class increase and what different income groups are there. And McKinsey Global Institute has done a good study on this, and you see it's rather exploding. Right? It's growing very much. And this had a lot of consequences for all kinds of consumption of food, of traffic, of car use, of habits to live, to places where to live, what kind of accommodation you would like to have. I had a presentation in our Indian workshop, and we were talking about food and about transport and about housing or something. And I just read one issue of the Times of India that very day. Right? It was in my hotel, you get it always under your door, you get the Times of India. And I had 3 articles that really contributed to our conference immediately. And this is every day there. Yeah? One article said that locals can have sometimes more have more importance than national chains. Retailing is a big issue in India these days. That national chains sometimes get worse deals than local shops, right? So this is one point for the local, but it's a difficult struggle. Then there was a big ad of Mercedes-Benz. And it was, I think, the new 310 CE or something. I'm not good at cars, you know. It's a big, huge car. And it said, transform the road. Transform the road. And in fact, this is more true than they might know. It's in fact a contribution to the story. There are very few people that can afford this Mercedes-Benz, but there are a lot of Japanese cars that are sold there that really transform the road because this is a contribution to the whole urban system, how it is developing. And the fact that urban planning and transport planning are separated still in many Indian cities leads to an urban sprawl thing. So that you get the density to create a very economically affordable public transportation system. And yeah, everything. And my last ad was the first page. The Times of India is the first, is the most famous Indian newspaper. But very often this newspaper comes with an ad at the first page. It reads the Times of India and then there's an ad. And very often there is a real estate ad. And at that very day it was a Spanish luxury villa that was sold, and there was an address where you can have it, and it was all kinds of attributes. And those attributes were very important. The first one was something like it's Vatu compatible, which is some sort of feng shui. So tradition is with us. Vastu. Okay. Thank you. 100% Vastu compatible. But then it was like safe environment for the kids. Green space, backup power, because there are a lot of power cuts in India. So you have your own backup power system. Safe environment, there were room for servants, and there was a pollution-free environment. And it was, a second ad, it was buy your home and get a car for free. And it was not the top level of society this was sold to, it was the upper middle class this was sold to. And now, if you see this, you learn something about the desires and wants that really drive society, right? This is really driving society. There are people that add advertise it, there are people that offer things, there are people that read it, there are people that facilitate that. This is a whole circle of development that is somehow to be questioned or changed, transformed in order to make it more sustainable. But what does that mean to make it more sustainable? In one sense, you could say this is a nightmare. You take this newspaper ad and you say, power backup, it's a diesel generator, I think. It's a new car, more emissions on the street, more traffic on the street. It's a safe environment for the kids, so you need a lot of space. You have a gated community, if you like, and so forth and so forth. Yeah? To some degree, it's one scenario that you can generate from that is a very high emission, if you like, a fossil-intensive scenario in terms of energy use. And it's a socially exclusive scenario that would go along with that. Because people that can afford this will buy on the market all those items. They have a safe energy, they have a pollution-free environment, they have everything, a green space, right? They buy it as a market good, and it's only a share of society that can afford. So it's a very socially exclusive and high fossil-intensive scenario. And to be honest, I think this is a probable one. You could also say, look, take those attributes, like safe energy reliance, safe energy system, public green space, pollution-free environment. If you take this and say, look, you are the planners and the urban planners and the political authorities that have to create a city here, this should be your goals to achieve. So you could also think about have a low fossil intensive, so a sort of renewable way. You could have this all with a renewable system. And you could have it as with a high share, with a more social inclusive way, in order to say, let's think about the public space. We need green space, we need safe space, and so forth. Why shouldn't this be a profile, how the public space, how the city as a whole should look like, instead of a socially exclusive market good? It's a collective good as well. With respect to this thing of renewable energy, you could, some people argue, well, people are too poor to have this. And in fact, I would have thought so before we were working there, but after a couple of years now, I have my doubts whether this city is really poor. If you calculate the debt, the public debt per capita, many Indian cities are less indebted than many German cities. It's a different level, but they have maneuver space. And they have a lot of money that they spend on private transportation. Man, those flyovers, they are made from concrete and so forth. There's a lot of money going in it, really. And the bus track, a separate bus track, which is not enforced there. In Cairo, where I was, there is a separate bus track, but it's not enforced. Everybody's using it, including buses, which are stuck into the traffic. But there is a bus track. You only, quotation marks, have to enforce it. And the young students of architecture that drove me from the airport to the university, they were somehow convinced that the Egyptian Cairo drivers would never accept this somehow, right? Even when we were, for example, traffic planners, there are traffic planners from Germany that wanted to demonstrate how the traffic could go in India. This was a very famous, for me it's a very, very impressive example. They had those computer animations that they have, right, of traffic with the camera moving and everything, and they had a German street crossing with red lights and things. You know, you don't have red lights. There are too many red lights in Hyderabad, for example. And if you have people not really care, and you have traffic in all directions, you would never expect it. You drive everywhere. I thought Rome would be bad, but it's not true. Hyderabad is worse. And this is the reality. And then we had Indian stakeholders there, and then they showed them this movie from traffic planners, the computer animation. And in order to make it more Indian, they digitalized those yellow cabs, those three-wheelers, motor rickshaws, in order to look it more Indian. And this was, I think, especially this was the effect when they showed it, people started laughing. Because they said, this is India? No, this will never happen in India. This is a German traffic situation. This is red light, you stop. This is Germany. Now, what I wanted to say is this is somehow difficult, but it could be overcome. With respect to energy, as I said, energy poverty, people are too poor. They are not too poor to invest a lot of taxpayers' money into private transportation. I said there is a heavily fossil fuel intensive energy system in India. And not only, and take only this as an example, there are many other places. And it is not very reliable. There are power cuts all the day, and very often the rural areas are cut off first, right? And this is, by the way, a way they regulate the resource use, the water use, it's water pumping. And electricity is more or less for free. There's a huge debate whether it's really free for the farmers, but it's a political thing, and it's more or less free. Farmers have to make an investment, but the electricity is somehow granted to them. It's a political issue. We have a democracy there. They can vote. And so any politician who wants to take it away from them has facing a hard time, because there are many of them. I mean, they are poor, but once in a while they are getting voted, right? And so forth. It's very difficult to remove that. So instead of charging price for electricity, they have a quantum regulation, like they take away the electricity from them. Right? They regulate the water tables are falling in Hyderabad and many places in India because of overuse of electric pumps, and so they cut simply electricity, so they cannot pump. So the water regulation goes not via the price of electricity, but via the quantum regulation. Nevertheless, there are a lot of power cuts, also in the city. And yes, if you are poor and living and you tap electricity and you need it for reading and it's going away, you don't have a lot of backup technologies. But if you have a small business, if you have a hotel, if you have a restaurant, if you have, I don't know what have you, a service center, many people, they really prepare. And it's unbelievable what people do, right, in order to prepare. It's like do it yourself, all kinds of stuff. Yeah? Many have, some have 20 car batteries, for example. They plug it together, and it's very dangerous. If you can afford more, you have diesel generators, for example. All hotels would have diesel generators. So you have a second, mostly fossil fuel-based backup system. And now if you count the money that goes into this, and we did this, how much is invested, how much are the running costs, investment costs, you come up with a huge amount of money, and there are some willingness to pay analysis for renewable energy system. And wouldn't there be this backup technology? I would say this is merely theoretical, because willingness to pay, would you pay €1 for a greener environment or something, right? And then people would say, yes, of course. It's virtual money, you spend it just like that. So willingness to pay analysis is somehow a little bit difficult. But in this case, it's not willingness to pay. In this case, it's just a system, a question of redirecting this real money. There's real money going in a second system, which is also fossil fuel based, which is millions of euro. It's not millions of rupees, it's millions of euro that the whole society is spending. Now, you could imagine that a decentralized renewable system would cost such and such and would be reliable. So you could, in a way, use this existing money to change the system. So I would not be too pessimistic here, because it's existing money. It's not money that they don't have. So you simply have to shift the system, if you like. Now, I would like to end by saying that in reality, emissions are going up. And they go up even faster than IPCC thought in 2001, right? The projections in 2001, how the next 10 years would look like in terms of emissions, were like different scenarios, and there was a bad one and a middle one and a lower one, and you would have chosen the middle one, for example, in 2001. But in fact, the measured emissions are higher than the highest scenario in 2001. So it can be wrong. Yes, there is uncertainty in climate science, yes, but uncertainty works both sides. You can even underestimate what's going on. So the reality is growing emissions, and the 2 degrees target, it's more or less more and more before the curtains. 2 years ago it was behind the curtains, but more and more scientists calculate with 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees. And for fun, let's say it's 6 degrees or something, which is really a different world. And so as being a sustainable people and you want to do some sustainable education, it is difficult to do it. And it's, I think, a good question to ask yourself, how is all this sustainable stuff linked to visions of good life, and how can you make sense of all this? And one last thing, Also in India, we had to make some pilot project because that's what the logic of the project. We wanted us to have some pilot projects. And as lifestyle people, it's really difficult to have a pilot project. As a traffic people, you look at one junction on the road and then you try to transform it. It's difficult, yes, but it's a tangible thing. But if you want to change lifestyle of people, there's no Ministry of Lifestyle or something like that. It's a very fuzzy thing. So we started, although I didn't like it in the first place, with schools, education. And I'm well aware of the fact that as everybody, as sustainable education people tell you all the time, and they are right, look, one thing we don't want to do is to make kids more sustainable, but you keep on going unsustainable way, right? Because this is not credible, this will not work. We cannot change the world while you spoil it. It's impossible. So there has to be some coherence here, and so it's only a limited thing, a limited effort that sustainable education can really bring. Now, having said this, we did a school project, and it somehow was, I think others also told us that from other organizations that do the same thing in India, it was quite good. And the point was, there is a lot of sustainable education in schools, but it's in the textbooks, mostly, right? They learn a lot. And it's in countries like India, but not only there, students are they'll have to learn a lot. They prepare for their grades and they get stressed and stuff like that. And so they have to learn another thing, right? If they learn about the earth is finite, yes, the earth is finite, and so on. It's not really helpful. And so what we did was we said, look, let's change the way the curriculum works and the way the commitment works. So we introduced some very playful things to detect things. We introduced also sort of competition between classes and between schools. And it was difficult to find out, to make some reduction of their footprint, for example, measurement of a footprint and reduction of their footprint with the whole class. And there was a competition between schools. And one challenge was, which is the microcosm of the world, if you like. We have governmental schools and non-governmental schools, private schools, and many more differences. But usually you have a school in a poor quarter with very little footprint. Yeah? And then you have a school which has, an international private school, which has a high footprint in a well-affordable quarter. And how do you now make a competition between the schools in the reduction of footprint? One school has simply to turn off one AC. They turn the temperature a little bit down in their air conditioning, whereas the other school doesn't have any air conditioning. They would have to scratch together a lot of things because they are poor anyway. And so we made a different calculation metrics so that we would weigh their effort in a way. And other organizations work with the handprint thing, like say, what is the good thing that you do to the environment? Okay. And funny enough, the government, the poor government school in our competition has won because they made a lot of small efforts, but we judged them to be, well, very creative and very good. And the richer school, they accepted it, funny enough. They could have also said, look, this is a rubbish. If you win, this is a bad competition. It's no good competition, but they did not. So one thing I want to say is at the end, I think we should be aware of the constraints and the necessity of the sustainable development thing, but I think it's more important to study how it is linked to the powers of a good life and how we could somehow make use of that in order to reach those goals. I think otherwise it will not happen, that this powerful thing of development will be brought in another direction. This is a very vague statement, but I don't have more concrete things to offer at this point for you. So I thank you very much for your attention, and we can discuss if you like.